Bader. I'm a senior fellow with the John L. Thornton China Center here at Brookings. For those of you who were expecting Tom Christensen, who was on the program as the moderator, Tom unfortunately had a personal emergency. He's not able to make it today, much to his and our regret. This event on understanding the U.S. pivot to Asia is sponsored by the John L. Thornton China Center and the Center for Northeast Asia Policy Studies at Brookings. The program will be available in audio and video on our website in about a day or two, for those of you who don't pay as close attention as you should. President Obama's November trip to Asia was described by members of his administration as illustrating the pivot in U.S. policy from preoccupation with the 10-year-old war in Iraq that was ending and U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, where withdrawal of U.S. troops was beginning. Some administration members described a pivot to the Asia-Pacific as central to the new strategy. Others talk more generally of a pivot to areas of higher priority to the United States, of which they identify the Asia-Pacific as one. The President's trip focused attention on the Asia-Pacific region, as such trips invariably do. But in this case, the focus was facilitated by a series of steps taken during the trip. The U.S. joining the East Asia Summit, and the President participating for the first time, highlighting of disputes over the South China Sea at the East Asia Summit and through Secretary Clinton's visit to the Philippines, announcement of an umbrella agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, grouping 9 Asia-Pacific countries, the U.S.-Australia agreement to deploy U.S. Marines to Darwin in Australia on a rotational basis for joint exercises and training, and the dramatic opening to Burma, highlighted by Secretary Clinton's visit to that country ending years of U.S.-imposed isolation. The media and some Asian observers chose to see all these steps as part of a blueprint for American containment, constraining, or pushback against a rising China. By contrast, administration explanations of the overall strategy and individual decisions emphasized U.S. objectives in Asia, the desire for a positive relationship with China, and specific rationales for each decision having little or nothing to do with China. The publication of the U.S. Defense Strategy report in January making clear the priority the U.S. places on the Asia-Pacific and on being able to overcome anti-access strategies of China and Iran, a heightened attention to the U.S. strategy. Today, our panelists will talk about these events, what they meant, what their purpose was, whether they represented a new policy, and what reactions have been in the United States, in Asia, and more specifically in China. Our speakers are well known to you, and you will have seen their bios on your way in, so I won't take time to spell out their considerable achievements. Our first speaker will be Ken Lieberthal. Ken is the director of the John L. Thornton China Center at Brookings and was my colleague at NSC in the late 1990s as Senior Director for Asia. Ken will talk about the overall purposes and objectives of the administration's Asia policy and challenges it faces in implementation. The second speaker will be Richard Bush, Director of the Center for Northeast Asia Policy Studies at Brookings and also a colleague of mine in the late 1990s as National Intelligence Officer for Asia and subsequently Director of the American Institute on Taiwan in Washington. Richard will speak about Asian reactions to U.S. policy. And our third panelist will be Jonathan Pollack, a Brookings Senior Fellow in the Thornton Center, expert on China, Korea, and the rest of Northeast Asia, and author of a wonderful book on North Korea, which I recommend to you all, who will speak about the Chinese reaction to U.S. policy. We will have Q's and A's after the presentations.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and Let me thank you for stepping in at the last second to moderate this panel as well as the panel that will immediately follow. I want to address 4 topics. One, the substance of the pivot, which Jeff kind of enumerated. I want to give a little nuance on that. Secondly, to what extent is this something new that we're seeing? Thirdly, what are the positive aspects of it? And fourthly, what are some of the concerns about it, or at least some of my concerns about it? So let me run through each of those in turn. First of all, substance. There are 4 dimensions, I think, to the set of policies that the President laid out so clearly when he made his 10-day trip to Asia on November 1st. On economics and trade, the focus here was on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We'll be having a much more detailed discussion of that in the second panel this afternoon. Let me just note broadly, this is a multilateral platform that is being negotiated involving countries of the Asia-Pacific region. It is what I would call WTO plus. In other words, it encompasses a lot of the kinds of things in WTO, but adds things like labor standards and environmental standards that go beyond what's in WTO. What was, to my mind, distinctive here is the President really focused on getting this negotiated and announced by December of 2012, I guess 1 month after the election this year. But it's a timetable that I haven't seen before. I note finally that, and pending this afternoon's later discussion, many of the details of this, including even the ultimate membership of it, remain in a process of development. So this is a target and a focus, but not a set piece that he was putting into place. Secondly, on the military side, the major message was that despite serious potential cuts in anticipated Department of Defense spending over the coming 10 years, our presence in Asia will not be affected by those cuts. A lot of the media focused on the announcement of rotational deployments of U.S. Marines in Darwin, Australia. We build up eventually to 2,500 people per rotation by 2016. My own feeling is that's a footnote, and that the real message here was overall defense cuts are not going to affect our position in Asia. Thirdly, on the diplomatic side, as Jeff mentioned, there was a focus on the East Asia Summit, first time a U.S. President has attended that. On the security side, it was really moving that to the center, I think, of U.S. multilateral security diplomacy in Asia. And then on economics and trade, the TPP. I think in both circumstances, this is moving our focus to forums where the U.S. plays a major leadership role, as versus other forums in which we participate, but where we have less of a leadership role, or the forum is less active and concrete, such as the ARF versus the EAS.
I'd like to thank my 3 colleagues for 3 excellent and provocative presentations. I'd like to ask the first question to whoever wants to take it, perhaps Ken, but others can join in. It's kind of a series of related questions. Ken, you mostly had praise for the specific steps that the administration took in the last few months. You implicitly had some, or explicitly had some problems with some of the messaging. Were there any steps that the administration took, has taken in the last 3-4 months that either you or other members of the panel would not support? If you'd care to expand a little bit on your thoughts on the public messaging, which I think Jonathan was, I think that was an undercurrent of Jonathan's remarks that was problematic. And last related question is, do you think that the U.S. presidential election had anything to do with either the steps or the messaging?
Okay. I want to take the hardest one first, which is your last one. I think, this is a political season, and so it's not surprising that the realities of going into an election year would encourage the administration to package this November trip in as integrated, comprehensive, and dynamic a fashion as they can. This was in the days leading up to the announcement that the Select Committee on the Hill failed to reach any agreement whatsoever. And the President was out of town for the last 10 days before that failure was announced. So I think he must have felt it was the better part of wisdom to make those 10 days really count in terms of messaging. On the specific steps, no, in fact, there's nothing that we did that I think was the wrong thing to do. And I think actually where I have a problem with the messaging side is, as I kind of implied in my remarks, more with what the Secretary of State was doing while the President was traveling. She joined him for part of the trip, but did her own stop in Manila. And I think if you go back and look at what she said on her trip and what the President said in their respective public remarks, you find that there is some daylight between them. And the Secretary of State was generally, tougher than the President, more closely, for example, talking about the West Philippine Sea, and things that, just stuff that kind of suggests there's a real taking sides here. The President, I thought, was very careful not to make those suggestions, although some of his rhetoric, especially in Australia, came close. I thought, nevertheless, the Secretary went farther, and I thought, frankly, personally, that was unfortunate.
Richard, John?
I'm glad you raised this question, Jeff. It warrants notice that much of these shifts in strategy, particularly from the point of view of the Defense Department, represented a kind of an out-of-cycle review. The shelf life on some of these documents coming out of the Pentagon seems to be getting much more attenuated, and it seems a very different time that back in 2009, Secretary of Defense Gates castigated so many in the Pentagon for what he referred to contemptuously as future war-itis. We seem to be back in that domain now, looking maybe not unreasonably at what are the kinds of capabilities you think you need to acquire looking ahead. But I think that the fact that this is all occurring in election year is no accident. Quite the contrary. I think it really highlights the extent to which, even if this did serve a major purpose in relation to perceptions of the United States in the region, it also has a utility in U.S. domestic politics as well.
Take questions from you all. You can wait for microphones. Yeah, if you could identify yourself and your organization, please.
Thanks. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report. And I want to ask about two of this scenario that we didn't spend much time on. The first is, and it's in the context of sort of imagining, looking out a decade or two from now, what might the configuration look like. The first piece of this is something that was articulated in a book a couple of years ago by Bill Emmett from The Economist, in a book called Arrivals, in which he noted that this would be the first time in history that Japan, China, and India were essentially world powers or competing world powers, all sort of coming into that at various, admittedly in various speeds and size, and that the potential for regional competition among those three is at least as significant as the ostensible potential between the U.S. and China. So that's one factor that I would be interested to get your reaction to. The second is noted in the Economist's cover story this week on China about the paradox of prosperity, and a spate of articles that have been written in the last month or two about China and Asia, in which, as the Economist puts it, the paradox of prosperity in China is that in order for China to continue its economic success, it will have to face political changes that are inimical both to the Chinese philosophically and also arguably to the engines of growth themselves. So I'm interested to know whether I'm interested to get your reaction to either of or both of those, the regional competitive piece and the domestic political piece. What's the salience of either of those, and what's the likelihood that those could be game changers?
Anyone? Well, why don't I take a stab at the regional piece? I think one of the ironic, but I think the potentially helpful aspects of these shifts in strategy is to give regional actors, not only the major regional powers, but also the middle regional powers, a different set of incentives for relationships and understanding vis-a-vis one another. That, I think, would be widely endorsed, or ought to be widely endorsed by the United States. I think we need to remember that however central the United States may like to see itself, excuse me, in Asia and elsewhere. Indeed, it was fascinating to see in President Obama's State of the Union address, he trotted out the line used by Madeleine Albright years ago about America being the indispensable power. Perhaps we are, but I think that in a relative sense, and this isn't to bemoan these changes or to say that this makes the U.S., puts the U.S. in a situation of decline, in a relative sense, the capacities of others are going up. We have ample incentives to cooperate with all of them, but even more important, if a true regional order is to be built, that's going to be something that falls much more on their respective hands than for the United States designing it from afar, if you will. That would be my thought. I don't know if anyone wants to tackle the domestic issue, but.
Let me just follow on the same thing. I mean, as I look at the interrelationships among the three powers you cited, I don't see a situation emerging where you have, if you will, an irresistible force and an immovable object. If there's going to be conflict, it's more likely to be because of friction, through accident or miscalculation. Also, don't sort of neglect the role of third parties or fourth parties to sort of entrap in conflict countries that don't have an interest to be fighting each other. And here, North Korea and Pakistan come to mind.
On your question about the regional thing, 10 years from now, I think what we ought to keep in mind is no one knows what 10 years from now will look like, and there's no way to know. The role of accident, the role of the development of different technologies that have their own dynamics. Recently, for example, social media, right, having a huge role around the world. It's 5 years old. 10 years ago, no one knew this was coming, right? I think we know very little about 10 years from now, even though we all have to make some plans based on assumptions about it. Those assumptions almost certainly will prove significantly wrong. But let me really address your first question about the domestic side in China, or second question, I guess, about the domestic side in China. I commented in my remarks how important the U.S. rebalancing its own economy would be to our success going forward. I could have said the same thing with equal force about China. In articulately different ways, the Chinese have already laid out their plans to rebalance their economy. The question there is whether they can implement it. With us, we're fighting over what the plans ought to be. But China has tremendous economic growth momentum. When you look at things like urbanization and the demand drivers that urbanization creates, the Chinese economy, in some form or other, is going to become the largest economy in the world by 15 years from now, probably long before that. But what kind of economy it is and how effective that makes China in dealing regionally and globally is really up for grabs. And I would argue the issue is not whether they undertake reforms that will undermine the system. The question is whether they undertake reforms that will preserve the system, right? But significant reforms are necessary that have been systematically postponed by the current administration in China. And therefore, the new administration is going to have one hell of an inbox. I think they know that very clearly. I think it's going to be 2 or 3 years before they can even begin to take those issues up seriously, changing incentives for provincial leaders, figuring out which major interest groups are going to be undercut as they rebalance the economy and so forth. So it's probably going to be 2014, 2015 before they even engage the issue seriously. And the cost to them of not engaging it go up every year.
If I could just add, there's some theorists, international relations, who like to talk about regional hegemony, and sort of take the U.S. experience, historic experience in Latin America as a model for what China may wish to do in East Asia, sort of a Monroe doctrine for Asia. I'm not sure who the Chinese historic figure is who correlates to James Monroe, Monroe doctrine. But I think the question you've asked implicitly demonstrates how inapt that historic analogy is. The notion that Japan, that India, I think you can add to that list Indonesia and Vietnam, would accept some sort of subordination of their national interests or some kind of bandwagoning with China, with a rising China, and become part of some bloc dominated by China, I think is contrary to everything we know about these countries' history. Chris?
Thanks very much, great discussion. I want to engrave Jonathan's last 2 or 3 paragraphs in bronze and pass them around if we can about the need to discuss things. As you know, I've been writing about this for the last few weeks.
Identify yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. I start talking about that thinking.
Everyone else, Chris.
Yeah. Never mind. Is it too soon to be looking at the utility of something like arms control talks for the future of Asia? Because what we're all talking about is an inevitable feedback process. If they're doing this, so we're going to do that. If we don't do this, we're accused of not being strong. And, we all know the rhetoric. And so much of this is starting to remind me of not so much the 1930s, but the 1950s. And we're looking back on a lot of sort of opportunities we kind of missed with the Soviets, and they sort of missed with us because we didn't really quite talk about it and we believed the worst about each other. Is it too soon to be looking at a way to discuss with the Chinese, guys, we don't really need to do this stuff. We need to do all of it. Thank you.
I'm actually about to publish a paper co-authored. That's my recommendation, that it's time that we start at least exploring areas of potential mutual restraint as a way to begin to reduce strategic distrust between the U.S. and China. So yeah, I think that's one of the things, among others. I forgot whether it was Jonathan or Richard who called for more serious, in-depth discussions than we've been having today in London, and that's one of 4 or 5 issues that we ought to be exploring pretty seriously.
It is definitely not too early. Hopefully it's not too late, because what I'm struck by, even in this context where there is the growing involvement of the United States in all the different multilateral fora and so forth, that you have essentially unconstrained weapons development programs country by country. I mean, to some extent there's limited transparency, but there has been, so far as I'm aware, very little effort, either at a conventional or even more interestingly at a nuclear level, to really think through and understand the implications of where countries may be headed and the extent to which that will make much more problematic, to put it mildly, any kind of regulated competition. I'm not trying to say that states won't pursue military modernization, but how they do it, toward what ends, and with what consequences for their mutual relationships and their relations with the United States are all open questions. So beyond all the arm waving that is often there about peace and collaboration and what have you, these processes continue on their own in any country that can afford these capabilities, and even some that can't.
Chris, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah. You're aware, of course, of the proposal of the
Obama administration did put forward to the Chinese in the Strategic and Economic Dialogue for discussion on 5 particular sensitive security areas: nuclear force modernization, use of outer space for military purposes, cyber issues, ballistic missile defense, and maritime security. And last May, at the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, they picked 2 of those topics for the first discussions: cyber and maritime security. And the innovation here was not, and 2 comments on it. The idea was to have the topics that were most susceptible of leading to the classic security dilemma, where 2 sides see each other taking actions and take counteractions to counteract either real or imagined intentions. And that's how these 5 topics were chosen. And the other innovation was to try to compel inclusion of both military uniformed officers and civilians in the dialogue, because for decades we've had discussions on some of these topics with the Chinese through foreign ministry channels, but the foreign ministry people know nothing about the topics and know nothing about the decision making or nothing about the strategy. So they are classic barbarian handlers in these discussions. So the idea was to get the PLA involved. Now the first discussions, it was, I don't know, an hour or so on each. How much can you do in an hour? And what you're talking about, I think, is sort of agreements and constraints. We are very, very far from that with a China that is uncomfortable even having these discussions, no less reaching agreements on them. But I'd say it's a baby step. Richard, did you? Chris, I'm in principle not opposed to what you're talking about and the other things my colleagues have mentioned. I would note, though, that 90 years ago, more or less, in this city, there was an arms control agreement for Asia and the Pacific, the Washington Naval Conference, and it failed. The effort to limit capabilities did not work to restrain the impulses that had just existed on Japan's part. And so it's real tough. Verification is real hard when you move from strategic to conventional. I think there are also sort of institutional dynamics in different countries. Procurement's driven by threat perception, and unless you control threat perception, how can you control the other? And so on and so on. Thanks.
So Matt, good. Purple tie. The gentleman in the purple tie behind you. The gentleman behind you, please. Thank you. Thank you.
Matthew Goodman, CSIS.
Yes, you're Matt Goodman as well. Thank you.
Matthew Goodman, CSIS, until recently in the Obama White House. I want to ask a question of Richard, but I want to comment on something that Ken said, which was about the not forcing China people to choose between the U.S. and China in the context of the TPP. And I think that and other cautionary notes you made are very well taken, and I think the administration's mindful of that. And I guess I would say that with respect to TPP, it's a voluntary undertaking, it's a negotiation. I think it's true, probably, the administration wants to establish a set of high standard rules that are more in the American image than others, and that has an element of trying to shape Chinese behavior. But although I don't think that's the primary driver, but I think that may be an element of it. But it is a negotiation, and so we'll push and prod, they'll push and prod and resist, and we'll come out somewhere in between. So I don't think the people who are participating in TPP are, reluctant or worried about, the China thing. There was a long queue of countries outside the door trying to get into that room. So I think, it's a little more. I mean, it's a good point to be mindful of, but I think it's not so operational in the TPP context. The question for Richard is, you expressed anxiety about follow-through, and I share that anxiety. What would be some of the elements of important follow-through be, in your view, to show that this rebalancing, which is probably the right word, although it does have 2 extra syllables, which is inelegant, but that would follow through, and what sort of metrics would you use to measure whether follow-through had occurred?
I guess the main one is the one that Ken mentioned, is that over time we get our domestic house in order and restore the pillars of our national power, which we've allowed to atrophy. And sustaining a reasonable defense budget and with smart procurements is only one part of that. I do have the sense that a lot of our diplomacy so far, or the administration's diplomacy so far, has been trip-driven and sort of focused on getting a lot of high American officials to the region at one time, and speeches and whatnot. And maybe we've accomplished what we needed to do with that, and what we need is more a steadier diplomacy in the various elements of our national power, not so much relying on the president's time or the secretary's time, but Secretary of State's time, but sort of deputy secretaries, undersecretaries going out and sort of getting concrete achievements that we can build on. You know, actually finishing Futenma in some way, you know, I think will be a real achievement and be a good platform for moving forward with Japan in whatever direction.
Nadia Chow with the Liberty Time, Taiwan. I think President Obama in his State of Union address, mentioned China 6 times, but majorly on economics. And yesterday, the deputy, national advisor also mentioned the major differences between U.S. and China is economic issue. And right now, the AIT chairman, Raymond Berhart, is talking about beef in Taiwan. I'm just wondering, during the election year, is U.S. Obama administration is ready to play hardball with Asian country economic issues. If that's so, what are the tools, extra tool U.S. have, and does U.S. worry about the counterbalance or pushback, since most of the Asian countries also have their own domestic pressure on economic growth? Thanks.
Looking just at Taiwan and what my friend Ray Burkhardt is doing, I would say that actually his focus on beef is really part of a larger discussion of the need for Taiwan to continue to liberalize its economy, not only vis-a-vis China, but vis-a-vis its other trading partners, including the United States. And that effort is being held back by problems on specific issues. We need to move those specific issues out of the way so we can get to what is really important in our economic relationship. And that's not because it's in U.S. interest, it's because it's in Taiwan's interest. That's the way, one of the ways that Taiwan is going to remain competitive in a very competitive globalized economy.
I think in a time of global economic stress and in a time of elections and successions, and especially in Asia, when you think Asia Pacific, it's the U.S., China, South Korea, Taiwan, Russia, conceivably Japan, all this year. Have our national level election or succession, that inevitably protectionist forces rise. And I think President Obama's actions, what he mentioned specifically in the State of the Union message, was that he is establishing an interagency group to really focus on rigorous implementation of trade policy. Not new protectionist measures, but rigorous implementation of trade policy. I think, frankly, that's a smart idea. First of all, where other countries aren't playing by the rules, we should hold them to account. We've got an economy in stress, and we ought to implement our policies rigorously in accordance with our national obligations. But secondly, it also is a way to make less likely more severe and less helpful measures from being taken in a politically tough year. So I think that's really what I was talking about. Frankly, with specific respect to China, my own read, Jeff would know better, but I'm not going to put him on the spot. My own read is that the president is genuinely very angry at China is not playing by the rules, at domestic subsidies and all kinds of other things that put U.S. firms and other global firms at a disadvantage and work to China's unilateral advantage. So I think he's very serious, but I don't think he's proposing a whole set of new protectionist measures. He's saying, I'm not going to shy away from vigorous implementation of what's on the books. And frankly, I think that's a correct thing.
If I could just add, first of all, Ken obviously is channeling me here. What he said is an absolutely correct description of how the president views Chinese economic practices. If you look at what Secretary Geithner had to say the other day in Davos, he was asked a question by Fareed Zakaria about China, and he dove directly into precisely the points that Ken made about Chinese subsidies, Chinese industrial policy, and the imbalances and dysfunctions these are producing for the world economy. I think that they're, and look at what Governor Romney has been saying about China. Look more recently at what the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee said about possible legislation on countervailing duties against non-market economies, specifically China. I think that there is something of a shift going on in the way American business, American political class views the Chinese economy. I guess what I would say is the stagnation of reform in recent years, and there are real risks of the world moving in a very protectionist direction towards China, not because of elections, but because of Chinese practices. I don't put a November timetable on it, but this is a reality that is not going to go away unless China takes more seriously the concerns of other countries. Let's take the gentleman in the line.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with the China News Review News Agency. My question is, how significant will the upcoming visit by Chinese Vice President Xi Jinping be for the U.S. government to assure the new generations of Chinese leaders that the U.S. pivot to Asia is not trying to contain China? What do you expect from Vice President Xi? Do you think he would be more aggressive and stiff, or more practical or flexible to deal with the U.S.? Thank you.
First of all, we have been assuring China privately in every way we can that the U.S. pivot to Asia is not aimed at China. So I think the Xi Jinping visit should be seen in that context. This is not the first time we have a chance to talk to top Chinese officials about this issue. Secondly, in terms of Xi's own attitude, he laid that out a couple of weeks ago, where he really stressed the need to have a positive, win-win kind of relationship with the United States. So he's teed up this visit in very positive terms. Thirdly, I think the real purpose of the visit, or at least my own view is the real purpose of the visit, is to get Vice President Xi around to meet with our top cabinet officials and with the president. Because after all, he is going to become the head of China. And so I think it's an opportunity for him to sit down with President Obama, with Secretary Clinton, I assume Secretary Geithner, Secretary Panetta, and so forth, and really begin to get a personal relationship or a set of relationships going with a certain comfort level
to it. I think we have time for one more question before the break, and then we're coming back for another panel.
I'm Jonathan Boder from Congressional Forum. I'd like to go back to an earlier discussion about India. In the Defense Department's white paper that came out earlier this month, they spoke specifically about the United States wanting to, as part of the declaration, developing a long-term strategic relationship. Now, you talk to different people around town, and you get different descriptions of what this long-term strategic partnership would entail. You talk to people on the business council, and they talk about endless U.S. arms sales and stuff like that. But also, they talk about more than just a partnership. They talk about an alliance, very much with India acting as a counterweight toward China. But then you talk to people from, at the Indian embassy, and they have a lot of reluctance to describe themselves as an ally of the United States. What I'd like to ask Jonathan and any of the others have had is, what can one realistically expect from this partnership, between this long-term strategic partnership?
I think the challenges of building and sustaining a strategic partnership of the sort that some believe is possible with India will be nearly as great as those involving China. India has no desire to be an American ally, to be tethered to an American strategy, to take orders from the United States, to be America's deputy in Asia. It just simply runs against the grain of Indian strategic thinking and Indian interests. So the first thing I would advise is to be realistic about it. I mean, we can even see already, for example, even if there are dreams of major weapon sales, the Indians have just announced that they will purchase the Rafale. So they don't feel sufficiently indebted to the United States, therefore, that you have to buy American weapons systems. You do have, of course, a vigorous debate in India about the long-term relationship with China, understandably. There's a lot of unpleasant history that they both deal with. But I just think it would be advisable to set the sights a little more realistically here. In particular, to, in effect, designate India without India having sought that. I mean, the DoD document specifies this is what we ought to do. It might be useful if we check with the Indians about this. In a curious kind of way, it reminds me of debates from long ago and far away when senior U.S. officials dreamed about China being the next member of NATO to oppose the Soviet Union. Ill-advised and at any number of levels. So I think India will be a much more consequential power. I think we have an enormous set of incentives to work with the Indians towards that goal, but let's not get off of these fanciful scenarios of how India will just do our bidding, if you will.
On that very realistic note, we are going to take a break. Thank you to our panelists for three really superb presentations and for executing it. Back at 3:15 for the next panel on Trans-Pacific Partnership and U.S. military strategy.